According to James Madison, knowledge of the law is the foundation of freedom and justice. When we try to understand the law that controls our obligations and contracts is not only for the learnings of the facts, it can be used as our armors to have the ability or to navigate the relations and transactions in our lives. Just like buildings, it needs kanang ligon nga pundasyon so we are as a person. If we truly understand the principles of the contracts and obligations, naa na tay kumpiyansa sa atong kagalingon to protect our rights, dili na ta bulok. That's why it is important to have our opportunities to learn something like this. Now, given the chance, let me introduce myself. Hello everyone, my name is Rechell Cinas, and today I'm going to discuss all about the legal aspects in tourism and hospitality chapter 3. So let's begin with the learning objectives. First, we have to identify the different kinds of obligations and contracts, then to enumerate the ways of extinguishing an obligation, then enumerate possible application of contracts in the tourism, travel, and hospitality industry. So now let's see the contents. First, we have the law on obligations and contracts, then the law on obligations, modes of extinguishing obligations, law on contracts, then the characteristic of a contracts. The law, a person desiring to engage in a business in the tourism, travel, and hospitality industry will meet certain obligations, agreements arising from contracts will have to be made, and potential breach from these agreements will be encountered. Therefore, there is a need to study the fundamental principles involving law on obligations and contracts obligations. Article 1156, an obligation is a juridical necessity to give, to do, or not to do. Now, let's go dive into the world of legal obligations. Let's start by understanding what an obligation really is. So in Bisaya, we call it obligasyon. Starting with an obligations in law, an obligation is a legal duty with four key elements. 1. Active subject or obliged creditor. Number 2. Passive subject or debitor. Number 3. Object prestation. Number 4. Juridical or legal type. So, upat ka obligations needed to be done. Think of it like a legal responsibility. As I stated, naani four ka parts. So, sa upat ka part, which is the juridical or legal, dinha na mag-connect ang tanan. And it is from the law or kasabutan. Then the types of obligations: to give a determined thing, deliver the specified item, maintain it responsibly, include accessories, and pay damages if breached. It really depends sa klase sa obligasyon kung unsa ang dapat sundon sa debitor. If it is to give a thing, then it needs nga ihatag jud sa debitor. Take care of it, i-appeal na sa tanang part and bayad kung naikulang. Whereas if it is about doing certain things, it needs to be done correctly. If naay mali, then ayuhon. And if sobra na ang kadakon sa mali, then kailangan ng bayran. Then to do, failure results in the task being done at the debitor's expense. If done improperly, it must be redone at the debitor's expense. Sources of liability. Number 1, fraud, intent to evade obligations and cause harm. Then number 2, negligence, lack of diligence or carelessness. Now, when it comes to responsibility, kinsa may naisala if there's something wrong or mali nga mahitabo. So, ug mentag ka nang magtago-tago or namotbot just para makalikay sa iyang obligations, mo na ginatawag natong fraud. And if it is just simple nga kanang kulang or kapabayaan ra, mo na negligence. That's why in our legal world, we all have the responsibility or obligation nga dapat sundon. So moving on, the law classification of obligations. Number 1, primary classification of obligations under the Civil Code. A. Pure and conditional obligations, articles 1179 to 1192. B. Obligations 1198 with a period, articles 1193 1198. C. Alternative 119, 1205, and facultative obligations, Article 1206. D. Joint and solidary obligations, Articles 1207, 1222. E. Divisible and indivisible obligations, Articles 1223, 1225, and F. Obligations with a penal clause, Articles 1226, 1230. 2. Secondary classification of obligations under the Civil Code. A. Unilateral and bilateral obligations, Articles 1169, 1191. B. Real and personal obligations, Articles 1163, 1168. C. Civil and natural obligations, Articles 1423, and D. Legal, conventional, and penal obligations, Articles 1157, 1159, 1161. So, alright, let's dive into some legal talk. So, as I stated, there are different kinds of, or na mga klase-klase sa mga obligations. So, first, we have pure obligation. This is straight up, no conditions or specific date para tumanon. That's why pwede siya dayon na demand. So, for example, let's say si Ariel nag-promise ni Brenda nga magbayad og 1,000. So, naapod tay ginatawag nga conditional obligation. This is the condition where there is consequence. For example, Carol. So, si Carol nag-promise ni Brenda og 1,000, hatagan siya 1,000 if Darren make into an outstanding employee of the hotel for the month of May. Then we have also obligation with a period. So this is the time na anay pizza nga nakaset nga dapat matuman. So for example, si Alfredo, an owner of an hotel, promised that mubayad siya ni Brittany og 5,000, which is an employee of the hotel, before mo December 30, 2024 as a part of the staff incentive program. Now, let's talk about joint and solidary obligations. Joint obligations, so mao ni ang mga creditors and debtors, but that doesn't need nga pare-parehong matuman jud. But when we say solidary obligations, kailangan siya nga pare-parehong matuman. Kumbaga, kung naa kay utang sa daghang tao, sila tanan pwede mag-demand nimo if the whole amount. Now the term joint and several in context mao ni ang pwede nimong mapapanagutin isa or tanang obligors depende sa gusto nimo. Pero syempre dapat it is clearly stated na sa kontrata or it is legally in the contract. Now let's go dive into the modes of extinguishing obligation. The law, Article 1231, obligations are extinguished. Number 1, by payment or performance. Number 2, by the loss of the thing due. 3, by the condonation or remission of the debt. Number 4, by the confusion or merger of the rights of the creditor and debtor. Number 5, by compensation. And number 6, by novation, extinguishment of obligation. So that personal obligations like partnerships and agencies cease upon death fortuitous events, unforeseeable events exempt obligors from liability of payment. Parties can stipulate currencies, else payment defaults to legal tender Philippine peso. Payment methods, we have checks only effective upon encashment, credit cards equivalent to third-party payment with reimbursement rights, natures of fortuitous events, causes natural, for example like earthquake and man-made, armed invasions, requirement must be impossible to foresee or avoid. Liability and theft, robbery, debtor must prove inability to resist violence. Thief, debtor deemed negligent if item not secured, liable for damages. Alright, when we talk about some ways nga pwedeng mawa ang obligations in a legal terms, so first, when it comes to personal things like partnership or agency, the debt of a particular or na involved is ma-extinguish sa obligation. There are also some other ways like having unfortuitous event or kagustuhan sa isa sa mga partido. For example, sa mga contracts like partnerships or agencies, pwede nang mahuman kung naay gusto mag-withdraw or mag-decide sa isa sa mga parties. And when it comes sa pagbayad sa utang, pwede ra stipulate or any of the currency. Kung way nasabutan nga specific currency din dapat bayaran gihapon gamit ang legal tender of the Philippines, which is the Philippine peso. When it comes to fortuitous events, mao ni ang mga unpredicted happenings that wipes out the obligor. This is the things that are not in our control, like the calamities. So dapat di lang unpredicted but dapat impossibly to foresee or avoid. It's either from the environment like earthquake, bagyo, or human-made disasters like gera. So if that happens, di na kailangan mo bayad pa sa kabuuan kasi dili nimo sala kung di na nimo mahimo ang imong obligations. So di na nato pugson. But it is important to know that dili pud sa obligor and cost sa paggawa sa obligations. So if kanang robbery or theft happens, dapat the debtor can prove it that wala dyan niya mapugni kinsa ba po'y magdahom nga such thing could happen. Then moving on to Article 1305, a contract is a meeting of minds between two persons whereby one binds himself with respect to the other to give something or to render some service. 1254A, essential elements of a contract. So we have consent, agreement between offer and acceptance on subject matter and cause, then object certain, clear subject matter of the contract, cause of obligations, reason for the contract's establishment. So the characteristics of a contract, we have number 1, mutuality of contracts, number 2, autonomy of contracts, number 3, relativity of contracts, number 4, consensuality of contracts, number 5, obligatory force of contracts. So now again, let's talk about contracts. In legal terms, contracts, it talks about two people in which is willing to commit or to give a thing or service sa isa. But for the contract to be valid, it needs essential elements, and these are first, again, the consent. It needs nga ang both parties magkasundo and nag-offer and then nag-accept in the terms and agreement of the contract. So dapat clear ang offer and absolute ang acceptance. Second, object certain. This is the thing or service mismo nga giistoryahan sa contract. Number 3 or third, cause of the obligation. This is the reason why naay obligation nga nabuo. Di naabot tayo gitawag nga contract of adhesion. So this is like one-sided contract in which isa ra ang nagdraft o ganang provisions, and usually it is a big company, but this one mostly just mo agree lang sa terms by signing, pero depende ra gihapon kay pwede gihapon nilang i-reject ang contract if they don't like the terms. Then there is also the characteristic of the contract. First, mutuality, it means pareho dapat ang duha ka partido. Then second, autonomy, it means pwede nilang ibutang sa contract ang gusto nila basta legal, moral, and etc. Third, relativity, binding ra ang contract sa mga parties na ni-agree. But there's exceptions like contract nga na benefits for the third person. Then fourth, consensuality, as long as nagkasundo mo verbally or in writing, considered nang valid ang kontrata. And fifth, obligatory force, it means once nga na ay contract, need jud siya sundon or pwede kang kasuhan sa court. As to this is the basics of the contracts, but syempre na may mas detailed rules and exemptions depends on the specific situation. So to sum it up, understanding legal obligations is crucial in navigating contracts and agreements. Knowing your rights and responsibilities can help prevent disputes and ensure fair dealings. So again, thank you everyone for listening, and that would be all. Goodbye.